Welcome to episode 85 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of the episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so all spelled out, SEVEN, health.com/85.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey all, it's Chris Sandel here, and welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. Today, it's another solo show, so me just digging into a particular topic in a fair bit of depth. And what I'm going to be covering today is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which is also known as the ACE study. And I'm really excited about this show, and I have to say, I love putting this one together. It's one where I've come into it knowing a little bit about the study and a little bit about the information, and I've learned a ton by putting this together. And not only that, it's information that I think is going to directly impact on how I work with clients. And I remember years ago coming across the Minnesota starvation experiment and how much of a profound shift that had on my understanding of physiology and dieting and behavior in the face of calorie restriction. And it's why I dedicated a whole show to the Minnesota starvation experiment, which you can listen to at www.7-health.com/42. And it's one of my probably top 5 most listened to podcasts. So it seems that I'm not the only one that's fascinated or interested by that study. Well, the ACE study and what I'm going to cover today is the same. It's information that should be integral to how we think about health. And hopefully by listening to this show, you'll see why it's so important and why I think it's so important. So what I'm going to do and cover as part of this episode is how the ACE study came to be. So its early beginnings as a weight loss study or something happening in a weight loss clinic, and then the biggest study that was then rolled out as part of that. We then look at the results of the ACE study, and this is huge, and it has implications on our health system more than really any other factor, or one of the biggest factors, and it's one of those things that people aren't talking about. And we'll look at why this is the case in terms of what happens as a result of adverse childhood experiences. And we'll look at that both from a behavioral perspective and also a physiological perspective, so we can make sense of why those health changes may be happening as part of what was identified in the study. And finally, I then just want to speak about how the study links into different books or documentaries or podcasts that I've come across or consumed, and putting this show together and going through the research really it sparks things within me where I thought of different things I'd read or things that I watched and made all of these connections. And I just want to talk about some of those things, and it will be a little bit of a brain dump of me just saying, check out this thing or check out that thing. But it was things that came up for me, so hopefully they're also relevant for you or they're also interesting for you. So let's go back to 1985 when all of this started. So there is a physician named Vincent Felitti, and he is the chief, or at that stage was the chief of Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego, California. So Kaiser Permanente has a number of different businesses all relating to health. So they have health plans and insurance for employees and employers and individual members. They also ran medical groups made up of physicians who could then provide medical care to these peoples. And the idea behind Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego, it was really twofold. So on one hand, they wanted to help people live healthier lives. So every year, more than 50,000 people were screened for diseases using advanced tests and advanced machines that could pick up problems before the symptoms would appear. So really trying to help people get ahead of the curve in terms of detecting stuff. But this wasn't completely altruistic. There was a profit motive in them doing this. So if Kaiser Permanente could spend a little bit of money up front to keep people healthier who then had insurance and had other health plans through them, by having these screenings and preventative methods, it was then going to save them huge amounts of money down the line in medical costs. So back to Felitti. So in 1985, he was running the whole of the preventative medicine department. And one part of this department was an obesity clinic. And it was for people who wanted to shed as little as 30 pounds, but it was really a clinic designed for people who were really big. So wanting to lose 100, 200, 500, 600 pounds. And throughout the 80s, the obesity clinic, it had a dropout rate of about 50%, which on the surface might not sound that surprising. I definitely know in the circles that I move and the podcasts that I often listen to and the people that I read, etc., there's this comments that dieting doesn't work, that 80% or 90% or 95% of those who go on a diet will gain it all back within 5 years. So something like a 50% dropout rate, it doesn't then seem that surprising. But when Felitti looked at the dropout records, this didn't appear to be what was happening. So the people who were dropping out weren't doing so because their weight had now plateaued, or they were struggling because the weight was now coming back on. They were actually dropping out when they were 50 pounds or 100 pounds or 200 pounds down and still losing weight. And this wasn't the only thing that Felitti noticed when he started digging through the records. One of the other things that he discovered was the people who were dropping out had all been born at a normal weight, and they hadn't gained weight slowly over several years. They'd had some situation or some point where they'd gained a lot of weight. It was done in an abrupt way. Their weight would jump up, and then it would stabilize again. So he decided to start to do face-to-face interviews with these dropouts to see what was happening. So he'd ask them a standard set of questions, and everyone got the same group of questions, and this went on for a couple of weeks when he made a simple error in asking a question that led to a breakthrough. So some of the questions that he was asking the clients or the patients were around weight. So it was, how much did you weigh when you were born? How much did you weigh when you first started first grade? How much did you weigh when you entered high school? How old were you when you became sexually active? How old were you when you married or married first? But when asking the question about being sexually active, Felitti fluffed the question. And to quote Felitti, he said, "I misspoke. Instead of asking how old were you when you were first sexually active, I asked, how much did you weigh when you were first sexually active?" And the patient who he asked, who was a woman, she responded 40 pounds. So for those who don't think in pounds, 40 pounds equals 18 kilos. So quite light. So Felitti was very confused. And so he asked the question again misspeaking and asking, how much did you weigh when you were first sexually active? And the patient gave the same answer of 40 pounds and then said, it was when I was 4 years old, it was my father. And to quote Felitti again, I remember thinking, this is only the second incest case I've had in 23 years of practice. I don't know what to do with this information. About 10 days later, I ran into the same thing. It was very disturbing. Every other person was providing information about childhood sexual abuse. I thought, this can't be true. People would know if this was true. Someone would have told me this in medical school. But it turned out to be the case. And as he continued to interview more and more of the dropouts and ask them about sexual abuse as children, it came up again and again. And he got other people involved. So it wasn't just him asking questions because he didn't know if he was bringing some kind of bias to the situation where he would get other people to ask. And the same thing was coming up. So you're probably asking, so what does sexual abuse have to do with dropping out of a weight loss program? And this is something I'm going to deal with later on in more detail, but two big reasons came up. The first is that food then becomes someone's coping mechanism. And when you remove their ability to eat to deal with their emotions, you remove their ability to be able to deal with life. So just because weight is coming off doesn't mean it's solving someone's problem, and actually you're removing someone's crutch. The second issue is someone's size can be providing protection for them. As one of the patients commented, overweight is overlooked, and that's the way I need to be. Another noted that she'd been abused by a number of people from age 4 onwards. She then married a man who abused her until she finally escaped. Now, every time she lost weight and some man would comment on her beauty, she would become terrified and she'd start eating excessively again until the weight was returned. So Felitti then spent the next 5 years working on this. And in 1990, he flew out to Atlanta to give a speech about his findings at the North American Association for the Study of Obesity. And the reception for his ideas were lukewarm at best. In fact, at the end of the talk, one of the experts in the audience stood up and said something to the effect of, the patient statements were simply fabrications to provide a cover explanation for their failed lives. But despite the fact that the speech didn't receive universal praise, it did catch the attention of Dr. David Williamson, who was an epidemiologist. Oh my God, I can't even say the word. From the US Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, so also known as the CDC. And Williamson was intrigued. And while the original study had involved only a couple hundred people, Williamson wanted to see if the same things were true or if it would stand up if you then involved the general population rather than just those who were going through an obesity clinic, and when it was involved with thousands and thousands of people as opposed to just a couple of hundred. And this is how then the ACE study came to be, with the CDC getting on board. So where Felitti was already working at Kaiser Permanente was actually the perfect place to do the study. So they had more than 50,000 members who were coming through the department each year, and they were getting comprehensive medical evaluations. So every person who came through the Department of Preventative Medicine filled out a detailed questionnaire that looked at their medical and physiological and psychological and social elements prior to undergoing then a complete physical examination and then extensive laboratory tests. So they had this huge amount of background information already sitting there, and all they needed to do was then include the extra questionnaire to deal with this new area they wanted to look at. In the original work with Felitti that he'd done at the obesity clinic, the questioning revolved around sexual abuse. But for this new study, they wanted to broaden this out and to look at many areas of childhood trauma that could possibly cause problems in later life. And they actually spent a year going through the literature to work out this stuff, to work out what the new trauma-related questions and areas would be. And these areas have actually been added to over the time. So it originally started out with just 7 areas, but at some point they added in some more, and today there are 10 areas that are included as part of this. And I'm actually going to include the different questionnaires in the show notes so you can go and see them there, but I will run through it now. So originally there were 3 categories of abuse. So looking at psychological abuse, physical abuse, and contact sexual abuse. And then there were 4 categories of exposure to household dysfunction during childhood. And these included substance abuse, so drugs and alcohol, mental illness, violent treatment of a mother or stepmother, and then criminal behaviour in the household. And when this got extended to 10 different areas, it then also included emotional and physical neglect, living in poor conditions or poverty, and then looking at things like separation and divorce. So these areas became known as adverse childhood conditions or adverse childhood experiences. And obviously the questions don't cover every possible scenario, but these were the areas that came up most from them doing a literature review, and then also looking at what were the more regular comments that Felitti had heard from his patients as well. And so these were identified as the important areas of trauma. So the way that the study worked was that 1,494 Kaiser health plan members who had completed a standard medical evaluation at the health appraisal clinic between August and November of 95, and then January to March of 96 were eligible to participate in the study. So in the week following them coming in and visiting the clinic and hence having their standardized medical history already completed, the members were then mailed the A study questionnaire. And anyone who didn't respond to that original questionnaire were then mailed a second questionnaire. And in the end, the response rate was 70.5%. So out of the 1,494 potential people, they ended up with 9,508 respondees. And there was actually then a second wave in which more people were mailed these questionnaires. So the final cohort was up around 1,900, but it was only the 9,508 people that were analyzed as part of the original study, and then the other chunk was under evaluation at the point at which that paper then came out. To give you some demographic ideas of the respondents, the average age of the respondent was 57 years old. The population breakdown was 80% white, 10% black, 10% Asian. It was 50.5% female and 49.5% male. 74% had been to college, 46% had graduated from college. So this wasn't a marginalized group, and given what was required to become a member of the Kaiser Health Plan, this population is probably best described as middle class, or at least a very good cross-section of the population. So we're not just looking at people who are very much part of the lower socioeconomic part of the population. This is a middle class group. So what did the research find? And the big thing that they found to start with is that ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are remarkably common. And while this may not be so surprising with, say, separation or divorce, this is more surprising for things like physical abuse or sexual abuse or incest, and incidents that are normally hidden away by shame and secrecy and social taboo. These things actually happen a lot more than most would estimate. So, for example, 22% of respondents said they had suffered sexual abuse. 25% had lived in a household where there'd been substance abuse, like alcohol or street drugs. 12.5% of respondents had seen their mother or their stepmother treated violently, and 10.8% had this violence turned on themselves when they were children. The most prevalent of the 7 categories of childhood exposure was substance abuse in the household, and this was largely alcohol more than anything else. And then the least prevalent exposure category was evidence of criminal behaviour in the household, and this was down at like 3.4%. I imagine if you were looking at lower socioeconomic populations, maybe looking higher, more at black populations, that this criminal behaviour in the household and people being in prison would go up quite significantly. So to make sense of the scoring of each category, every category was given a value of 1. So if you'd say never experienced physical violence growing up, you'd get a 0 for that category. If you had experienced it, you'd get a score for 1. So for each category, it would either be a 0 or a 1, and then you would add up the score at the end. So in the original category or the original study, it would be a score out of 7, and more recently, because of the new categories, you get an A score out of 10. And in the original study, there were 7 categories, and more than half of respondents, so 52%, said that they experienced 1 or more categories of adverse childhood experience, and 6.2% reported 4 or more experiences. And one thing I will say is that the scoring here is binary. So, as I said, it's either a 0 or a 1. So you could have a situation where someone was molested once, and so they get a score of 1, and then you have someone who was molested multiple times, had this going on over the space of years. And in both situations, they're just getting a score of 1 for that category. So you can have 2 people with the same A score, but the degree to which they have suffered or what happened could be very different. But despite these limitations, I still think the information is very enlightening and it's very important, as I'm going to go through. Because what they then did was they started to look at people's ACE scores and compared it to different health factors. So they looked at 10 factors that contribute to the leading causes of morbidity and mortality in the United States. And later on, with subsequent studies, they've looked at more and more risk factors. But originally, they just started with this 10. So the risk factors included smoking, severe obesity, physical inactivity, depressed mood, suicide attempts, alcoholism, any drug abuse, then injection drug abuse, a high lifetime number of sexual partners, so that's 50 or more, and then a history of having a sexually transmitted disease. They also looked at or assessed the relationship between childhood exposures and disease conditions that are among the leading causes of mortality in the United States. So they got this information from the participants' medical records. So as part of this, they looked at ischemic heart disease, so including heart attack or use of nitroglycerin for chest pain. They looked at all cancers. They looked at stroke, chronic bronchitis or emphysema, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD, diabetes, hepatitis or jaundice, and then they looked at skeletal fractures as a proxy for the risk of unintentional injuries. So what is then the link between someone's ACE score and their health outcomes? Well, it turns out to be quite a lot. And Felitti goes on to say that the ACEs are the leading determinant of what happens to the health and social well-being to a nation's population. So not just one of, but the leading determinant. And as someone's ACE score goes up, so does their prevalence for smoking, severe obesity, physical inactivity, depressed mood, and suicide attempts. And the same can be said about alcoholism, use of illicit drugs, injection of illicit drugs, 50 or more intercourse partners, and a history of sexually transmitted diseases. In simple terms, the research found a strong dose-response relationship between the number of childhood exposures, or their ACE score, and each of the 10 risk factors for leading causes of death. And they also found significant dose-response relationships between the number of childhood exposures and the following conditions. So ischemic heart disease, cancer, chronic bronchitis, emphysema, history of hepatitis, jaundice, skeletal fractures, and poor self-related health. And let me give you some numbers to put a little bit of perspective on this. So with an ACE score of 6, that person is 4,600% more likely to inject drugs than a person with an ACE score of 0. The same person with an ACE score of 6 is between 3,100 and 5,000% more likely to attempt suicide compared to someone with an ACE score of 0. In fact, having an ACE score of 6 reduces life expectancy by almost 20 years. And ACE scores also correlate with domestic violence. By an ACE score of 5, your chance of domestic violence has increased by over 500% versus an ACE score of 0. The likelihood of being raped goes up by 900% as an ACE score increases to 5 or more. As your ACE score goes up, the rate of unintended pregnancy and or abortion goes up. So does your chance of having 3 or more marriages. So let me quote Vince Felitti again. He said, "With an ACE score of 0, you have a very medically uninteresting population. Non-obese, non-smoking, non-alcoholic, non-diabetic, non-hypertensive, no internist has a chance of making a living with this group. But with an ACE score of 4 or more, this is big medicine, because the things we call risk factors are effective coping vices. Many of the things termed public health problems are in fact personal solutions." And this is a good quote for us now to look at why ACEs cause the behaviours and their health problems that they do. And I touched on this briefly earlier, but I want to chat about it in more detail here. And let's start with the behaviour side of things. And I'll first comment on the actions people take, but then also map it back to why this is occurring based on the science of what we know happens to changes within the body because of ACEs. So many of the risk factors that people participate in, whether we're talking about smoking or drinking or drug use or promiscuous sex or overeating, these things are done as a coping mechanism. The behavior gives the individual a sense of control or a way to numb or to change their emotions. So even if on the surface it seems like risky or dangerous behavior, in that moment it feels like the best choice available. But it's not always just the momentary comfort that someone gets. It can also be how this behavior changes how other people relate to them. And as I commented earlier on, many people who are obese weren't like this earlier on in life, but after experiencing some form of abuse, they changed their body in the way to make it less likely to happen again. So women commenting on making themselves less desirable by society standards so they can avoid the attention of men. And now this often can be someone becoming bigger, but it can also happen in the opposite direction. So women who experience abuse during puberty, when they are developing and becoming more womanly, their way of coping isn't to become big, it's to become small. So they will restrict, they will starve to become androgynous and hopefully less of a target of future predatory behavior. For guys who suffer abuse of some kind, they may become bigger in a hope that people will leave them alone. And this can be just getting fatter by overeating, but it could also be someone going to the gym and getting bigger. And while I haven't seen it, it would be interesting to see some statistics on hardcore bodybuilders and people who spend a considerable portion of their life trying to become bigger and bigger and how this correlates with ACE scores. Maybe it would show nothing. Maybe it would show some interesting findings. Let's look at then how ACEs affect physiology, because this can happen in a number of ways. So first, it increases the stress response in the body. Having higher amounts of hormones like cortisol and adrenaline and aldosterone, and these are part of the body's fight, flight, and freeze mechanism. And there's nothing inherently wrong with turning this stuff on. We want to have the ability to cope with immediate dangers, but the context is important here. And Nadine Burke-Harris is someone who has done some really great work on studying ACEs and then working with people based on this research, and also working very much with people who don't have the kind of money to be able to pay for a lot of these types of treatments, and really working with people in that lower socioeconomic bracket. And to quote her, she says, well, imagine you're working in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal glands. And they say, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you're ready to either fight that bear or run from that bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night, and this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive and health damaging. Children are especially sensitive to repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. And it's a great quote, and I want to walk through some of the impacts on the brain and the body that she's referring with. So starting with the brain. So ACEs affect the pleasure and reward center in the brain, and this can be linked into things like substance dependence and risk-taking. ACEs affect the prefrontal cortex, which is needed for impulse control and executive function and is critical to learning. And in episode 74 of Real Health Radio, which you can find at www.7-health.com/74, I looked at goal setting. And one of the things I talked about in that was delayed gratification, and I referenced the famous marshmallow experiment done with 4 and 5-year-olds. And what they found was typically those who had worse impulse control came from more chaotic households. So this would link into ACEs. Harris also talks about kids who referred to her because of supposed ADD or ADHD. And actually, they didn't meet the criteria for these despite their problems. And this was coming from a home environment that was producing higher amounts of ACE scores and them just living in fear. And on the MRI scans, there is a measurable difference in the brains in the fear response center. So their default setting is them just being on the edge all the time. So there's these real neurological responses for why people who experience childhood adversity are more likely to engage in risk or high-risk behavior. But it's not just the brain that is affected by this stress or these situations. Stress really has a body-wide impact. So it affects the immune system. And part of the immune response becomes really heightened because there's this real inflammatory response because of stress. But then part of the immune system becomes suppressed. And after all, we use drugs like cortisone to suppress the immune system. So when the body produces high amounts of this stuff itself, it's also going to have the same response in terms of suppressing it. And this means that people who have experienced more ACEs are prone to autoimmune diseases and to many of the inflammatory type conditions like cancer and cardiovascular disease. It affects bone health. So hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are catabolic, which means they break things down. And in young children and in teenagers, when they should be in an anabolic state, so a building state, this isn't great for bone health or health in general. And while it isn't mentioned in the original study, I would be interested to see how it affects sleep. Because typically when stress hormones are high, sleep is impaired. And this is going to have a knock-on effect with really every system and organ within the body, because sleep is when the body is doing its repair work, and it's crucial for childhood and adolescent development. I mean, ACEs even affect the way that DNA is read and DNA is transcribed. So really, from my perspective, it wouldn't surprise me if any or all systems in the body were affected by ACEs, and that these areas can then become compromised. As part of the original paper for the ACE study, there is a pyramid diagram that they use to describe this change process by the ACEs. And I'll put a link to this again in the show notes, but let me just walk you through it here. So the pyramid goes from bottom to top, and it represents the changes that happen from birth to death. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the adverse childhood experiences. The next step up the pyramid, you then have social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. So this could be that a child struggles to have friends, or they could find it difficult to concentrate in school and learn. They may get into more fights because this is their default way of dealing with their emotions. So really this can play out in many ways. The next step up then is the adoption of health risky behaviours. So as they get older, they discover the power of eating or drinking or smoking or drugs or sex as a way of coping in their life. The next step up is then disease, disability, and social problems. So because of these behaviours, maybe they have a harder time holding down a job or getting a job in the first place, or they're unable to look after themselves because of their addiction, or they are now suffering with an autoimmune condition or have heart disease, or they're on multiple drugs to deal with some neurological condition. And then the final step up, which is the top point of the pyramid, is early death. And all of these steps lead to a shorter lifespan. And like I mentioned earlier, if you have an ACE score of 6 or more, it's likely that life is going to be cut short by roughly 20 years. But there is one big thing that I want to mention here. And on the surface, the health conditions attributed to the higher ACE score doesn't seem that surprising. If you spend your late teenage and then your adult years drinking heavily or smoking or eating poor quality food to excess, is it really that much of a shock that someone is then having a shortened lifespan? Well, it turns out that this is not solely the fault of someone's behaviours. So when they then look at people who have a high ACE score, but then they don't drink or they don't smoke or they don't participate in these high-risk behaviours. So on the surface, they should be like any other health-seeking or normal human being. Well, if they have had those ACEs, they are still more likely to suffer with things like heart disease or cancer, for example. So the changes that the ACEs have on the body are from these experiences. They're not solely because of the resulting behavior that someone then takes because of this. And something else that I want to mention is the changes that people make because of the adverse conditions in childhood. And up until this point, we've talked about risky behaviors. So things like smoking or drinking or alcohol or drug abuse, that kind of thing. But there's also a tendency for people to participate in behaviors that can be equally damaging, but are often thought about as positive within our society. And this is the tendency to overwork or to overachieve. So we hold hard work up as a virtue in our society. We have this belief around meritocracy, and the people who make it are the ones that put in the most blood, sweat, and tears. And when we look at this, like, where do we cross over a line? When does hard working change from being something that is admirable to being something that is compulsion and addiction? And Dr. Gabor Mate is someone who I've referenced before on this podcast. He's done a ton of work around addiction and trauma. And in his own life, he suffered as a young child, growing up in Eastern Europe during the Second World War, and lots of relatives going off to the gas chamber, being Jewish, and how much of an impact that had on his life. And he is identified as being someone who overworks and struggles with work addiction. I also thought of, when I was reading through this stuff and listening to it, someone like Tony Robbins, who is uber successful in so many areas of life. He's built multiple businesses that collectively are worth billions of dollars. And he talks about his own trauma in childhood and dealing with his mother and dealing with her many partners and abuse, etc. And for the interviews that I see with him, he just talks about how much he works and this just real desire to overachieve. And it's interesting because it is a really grey area. There isn't a clear definition for what is overworking, because it's not necessarily going to be the hours that someone does, but how they think maybe about their work or what happens when they try and have time off. But again, this is going to differ from person to person. So maybe it's the feelings they get around work. Like, is there a constant feeling of not being enough, like a hole that isn't filled up, no matter how much money is achieved or how much success is achieved or how many hours they work? So I don't really have an answer on this stuff, but it is qualities that come out because of this. There are certain qualities that we aspire to or respect within our society that actually could be problematic. And this could be the same as I commented earlier about someone going to the gym and creating this body that we as a society deem as great or wonderful or whatever. But behind all of that, the drive and the reason for doing that could be coming from not a great place. And these kind of questions came up for me when doing this research. And it made me think of Malcolm Gladwell and one of his books and also one of his podcasts. So the book that it made me think of was David and Goliath, which is his most recent book. And the premise of the book is that we often have things backwards, that things that we think of as advantages can really be disadvantages, and things that we think of as being a problem can actually lead to other strengths. And there's a chapter in the book where he's talking about people who have lost either one or both of their parents when they were very young. And while this can be devastating, in some cases it can be the reason that we make helpful progress. And he recounts the story of Dr. Emil J. Freireich. And Freireich is the son of a Hungarian immigrants, and he was raised during the Great Depression in Chicago. And he suffers through a childhood of great poverty and neglect. So his father dies when he's 2 years old. His mother has to work in a factory. He doesn't have a very enjoyable childhood. And these experiences make him a very hard and angry man. And he then becomes a doctor and eventually leads a series of clinical trials of a new drug treatment for child victims of leukemia. And it's really brutal work that he does. So before Freireich starts the work, the survival rate for children with leukemia is basically zero. It's a horrible way of dying. They're basically bleeding from everywhere. And part of the treatment, so what Freireich starts asking the children to do to try and work out how he could start to help them, people thought of what he was doing was even worse than that. So he was taking marrow out of their bones, which is incredibly painful. And he was doing this over and over again with kids who are already in huge amounts of pain and who are 3 and 4 and 5. And by doing this work, he started to make some headway and he started to get it so that they weren't immediately dying. He was able to buy some time. And by doing this, he was then able to turn his hand to chemotherapy and look at what they could do there. And traditionally, they would have people on one chemo drug. But what he decided to do was see what happens when we put people on 2 and 3 and 4 types. And again, this came with horrible side effects, and people were looking at this and saying this is absolutely barbaric. And he was doing work that just other doctors didn't have stomach for. They couldn't deal with it, or they didn't think it was fair to make kids have to go through this. But because of his upbringing, his belief was that humans can endure horrible things and make it out the other side. And this was going to eventually lead to a treatment for leukemia, and that it was going to be worth it. And thankfully, he turned out to be right. And in 1965, after years of work, he published a paper announcing that they had developed a successful treatment for childhood leukemia. And today, the cure rate for this form of cancer is more than 90%. And the idea of doing multiple types of chemo drugs together is born out of a lot of the work that he did. So while ACEs are clearly problems from a health and risk or high-risk behaviour, and there are many problems with them, there may be, in some circumstances, some benefit from the adversity. And this is something that comes up again and again in the book. So people who have struggled with poverty or dyslexia or losing a parent as a young child, and as adults, they can see how this has now benefited them. But when asked if they would wish this on other children or on someone else, they would categorically say no. One thing I am wary about with this kind of thing is the survivorship bias. So for every person that had dyslexia or had childhood troubles that then spur them on to see them as a great advantage, there could be 100, 1,000, 10,000 who actually receive no benefit from this stuff at all, but instead it creates this gaping hole in their life that they've struggled to overcome. And it's just the fact that these people have rose to prominence and are then talking about this stuff that we start to think, okay, maybe this has helped them out, when actually we don't talk to the masses of people who've really been affected by this, who it hasn't been a positive experience. The other Gladwell content that it reminded me of was an episode of Revisionist History, so his podcast show. And I can't stress how much of a fan I am of this show. There was just 10 episodes in season 1, but it was phenomenal, and I'm hanging out for season 2. If you haven't listened to it, then check it out. I will put it in the show notes. So as part of this podcast series, Gladwell did 3 episodes that were dedicated to education. The first was on the school system. The second was on university admissions and how people of lower socioeconomic standing can make it into universities. And then the third was on donations to universities and these massive donations that are made, and often to universities who already have huge amounts of money. But it was the first episode in the series that I'm thinking of, and it's called Carlos Doesn't Remember. And it tells the story of Carlos, who is this brilliant student from South Los Angeles. And he attends an exclusive private school on an academic scholarship. And he is the kind of person that American meritocracy is supposed to reward. So what the show then does, though, is detail how much of an anomaly Carlos is. And even for Carlos, things are pretty uncertain, because the episode looks at those living in poverty and coming from poor homes and poor living conditions like Carlos, where there's drug addictions, where there's beatings, where parents are in prison, where parents are murdered. And it talked about the fact that even if those who are incredibly talented are spotted and can rise to the top, the chances of this happening are tiny. That the inequality in income and in family life and the class divide makes such a difference. And that the idea that if people can just get their head down and put in the work, that this is the great leveler. And what Gladwell shows is it's not that simple. If you are living in a household with all of these conditions going on, the chances are something is going to get in the way of you being able to continue the studies regardless of how brilliant you are. And the study also reminded me of a documentary called Call Me Lucky. It's about a comedian called Barry Crimmins. It's on Netflix for any of you who are interested. It tells the story of Barry's life as a comedian and his battle with alcohol. It also talks about his tireless work that he's done to fight for the downtrodden and to really rally against politics and foreign policy. And it just shows how well read he is on these topics, and he was back in the 1980s when you didn't have the internet and there's very easy access to this kind of information. But it also reveals about Crimmins' early life and how he was the victim of rape by a babysitter on multiple occasions, and the activism that he now does in this area, and just how much that incident has spurred on his entire life, in some ways for the better, but also a lot of the negatives that have come out of it. And so my apologies if this section feels like a little bit of a stream of consciousness, but these were just some of the stuff that came to mind as I was going through this. And something else that came up for me is how ACE scores could be skewing research results. And so typically when studies are done, they will control for certain variables that we're aware of can cause an impact. So things like age or smoking or alcohol intake are typically controlled for or affect the results the way that they're calculated because of their potential impact. But does this happen for ACE scores? So let me explain using obesity, considering this is what the original part that kicked all of this off because of Felitti's work at the obesity clinic. So in most medical circles, obesity is seen as a problem, and I know there are movements that dispute this, like Health at Every Size, but let's just stick to the standard view for now. So obesity is seen as a problem. It's talked about that the extra weight and the fat that is on the body is really causing this problem. But if we look at the research and see that those who have higher amounts of ACEs are typically heavier, this could then be skewing the results. Maybe it's not the weight, it's the ACEs that are giving someone the worst outcomes. And maybe when we then look at those who are heavy and then lose weight and are able to keep it off, what happens if the people who are more likely to do that are those that were sitting at a higher weight for reasons outside of ACEs? So maybe they just had, been eating poorer, hadn't been doing the exercise, and when they then started to do that, the weight then comes off. But when then comparing those who have stayed at a higher weight and those who have then lost the weight, we're talking about not just the result of weight loss. What we're actually comparing is people who are now thinner who don't have ACEs versus people who are heavier who do have more ACEs. Or what about those who are a normal weight and have a high ACE score versus someone who is heavier and has no ACE score or has an ACE score of 0 or 1? What would happen in these scenarios? And for all of these scenarios, I don't have the answer, but it feels like a big confounding factor that could be misleading our understanding of weight and health versus ACEs and health. And this means when people talk about the cost of obesity on the NHS or the healthcare system, or the cost of alcoholism, maybe we should be talking about this stuff as the cost of adverse childhood experiences and the cost of trauma. And this could take some of the stigma away from the victim blaming and looking at the real root cause of these problems. And this isn't to say that every person who ends up being an alcoholic, or every person who is sitting at a heavier weight has gone through adverse childhood experiences. That is definitely not what I'm saying. But I think this is a big factor that most of the time people don't even think about or acknowledge when we have real research showing how much of an impact this can really make. And this then brings us on to the question of what can we do about this situation. And honestly, I really don't have much in the way of solutions here. It's not really what this episode is about. I was more wanting you to understand the importance of this information and bring it to your attention and just explain how much of an impact this can be having on people's health and someone's decisions. But if I was to make a few comments or offer some ideas, first and foremost, we need to be removing the taboos around these topics, and doctors and those providing medical support need to be asking these questions. And someone doesn't have to go through this every single time. Like, once these questions have been asked the first time, in future, patients can then be able to say, I have an ACE score of 3 or I have an ACE score of 7 as a shorthand way of giving some background information to explain maybe the likelihood or some of the reasoning behind certain health conditions or certain outcomes. We need to stop believing that this stuff only happens to the smallest fraction of the population, because as the results show, this stuff affects large numbers of people. And I'm not saying that we then normalize it in the sense of it's happened so often, so it's not a big deal, but recognizing it's something that happens very regularly and it is having a direct impact on people's health and behaviors. And I really love the work of Dr. Brené Brown. She talks a lot about vulnerability and a lot about shame, and I feel like she offers some really great advice around this stuff. So I would check out any of her books. One of the best bits of content of hers from my perspective, and it's something that I regularly recommend to clients, is a recording of a seminar that she did. It's called The Power of Vulnerability, and it's available on Audible. It's about 6 hours long, so you can listen to it in chunks if you don't want to sit down to 6 hours worth. I've not had a single client who I've recommended that to who hasn't then raved about it. And most of them actually finish the full 6 hours and immediately start listening to it again. And I also think we need to be providing better education and support and assistance. Education so that people know the damage of this stuff. And I don't think that just knowing the damage of this stuff as a parent is going to be the solve this situation. So it might not change how that parents in all cases, but I still think it's going to be valuable. But for those who have suffered and those who are struggling as either a teenager or as an adult or anywhere in their adult life, we need to be able to offer those people support. And whether that be therapy or a higher standard of medical support, or at least interpreting their medical situation through the lens of the ACEs, whatever this needs to be, I think there needs to be more of a focus on this area. The final thing I just want to mention is also how this research and putting this podcast together has made me reflect on my own life. And I've been incredibly fortunate to grow up and live in a household with 2 wonderful and fantastic parents and 2 equally wonderful siblings. And I didn't choose any of this stuff. It was just complete dumb luck that I ended up being born to those people. And when I look at the ACE test, I come up with an ACE score of 0. And so for me, it's now not surprising that I have the good health that I do. And sure, I eat really well, I sleep really well, I study nutrition, so I do the things that are considered healthy. But I also grew up in an environment that gave me the best chance of staying healthy regardless of what I did with those things. And there were times when I wasn't particularly healthy in my eating and my drinking and all of those things, and the effect was a lot smaller than it would be on other people. And I wake up most days feeling overwhelmingly grateful for the life that I have. And this show has just really added to that by doing the research and finding out about this information. And so, Mum and Dad, I don't know if this is one of those rare occasions where you listen to the show, but thank you for everything. So on that rather soppy note, this is it for this week's podcast. As I said earlier on, the original A study and now the hundreds of further studies that are done in this area are a really big deal. And this information is going to impact on how I work with clients, but also how I think about symptoms and issues that they are dealing with. So if you want to look at the ACE questionnaire and work out your own score or any of the other stuff that I've referenced, it's going to be in the show notes. That's www.7, all spelled out, seven-health.com/85. I will be back next Thursday with another guest. So until then, look after yourself.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7, seven-health.com.